Our guest tonight is David Enrich. He is a deputy investigations editor for the New York Times, where, in his words, he, quote, writes about the intersection of law and business, including the power wielded by giant corporate law firms and the changing contours of the First Amendment and libel law, often with a focus on things like institutional wrongdoing on Wall Street and in corporate America, all of which are topics, of course, that are of great interest to this program. He's the author of 4 books, including his latest, Murder the Truth, that reviews attacks on press freedoms and the campaign to overturn the Supreme Court's pioneering decision in New York Times versus Sullivan that protects reporting from frivolous defamation lawsuits. Last week, he published an outstanding piece of reporting in the Times under the headline, UnitedHealth's Campaign to Quiet Critics. I read that article with great interest. I thought the reporting was outstanding, and so we are happy to have him on our program tonight to discuss all of these topics in which he's playing such an important role. David, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
All right, so let's start with your article. There obviously was a lot of attention paid, I think, for the first time publicly to UnitedHealth when its CEO, Brian Thompson, was gunned down on the streets of New York, allegedly by Luigi Mangione. And I think people were kind of surprised to see how much kind of unexpressed anger and resentment and rage there was at UnitedHealthcare, not necessarily supporting what the murder, of course, but just an anger at the health industry in general. And before we get into the specific ways that they're attacking and suppressing criticism or dissent, as you reported, can you just talk about the size and scope and power of UnitedHealth? People know it's a health insurance company, but the other sorts of things it does inside the American health system?
Yeah, I think by most measures, it is the biggest healthcare company in America. And it's the biggest health insurer, but that's only one part of its business. And it runs a huge pharmacy benefit manager that basically acts as a middleman between insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies and drugstores, and basically is often accused of basically jacking up the prices that people pay for prescription drugs. It increasingly has a big role in dispensing actual medical care. It's bought up medical practices all over the country, and it's not only ensuring and paying for care, it's also administering the care. And so, I mean, it's kind of like a great hospital or medical system octopus that has its, fingers or tentacles, I guess, in many, many corners of the healthcare system. And it's huge, and it makes hundreds of billions of dollars a year in revenue. And so I think that the fact that it touches so many areas of healthcare and the fact that the American healthcare system is so deeply screwed up, I think it's made the company a real lightning rod for a lot of criticism.
I think the principal expression of anger at UnitedHealth when all of this happened with the murder of its CEO had to do with, and I think this is the way most Americans interface with UnitedHealth as a health insurance company, that they pay premiums for so long, and the minute they actually need coverage for some significant health problem for themselves or their family, they spend enormous amounts of time on the phone begging for coverage. UnitedHealth concocts ways to deny coverage. Is this, in your view, a valid source of anger toward the health insurance industry in general and UnitedHealth in particular?
Oh my goodness! Like, unquestionably, yes. There is, and the American healthcare system is deeply troubled. I think almost anyone who lives in this country and interacts with the healthcare system in any way, whether that is trying to get coverage for much needed medical procedures or even getting prescription drugs in an affordable way, would agree that the system we have is infuriating and often unnecessarily expensive and often unnecessarily cumbersome and prevents people from getting medical treatments that they need. And UnitedHealthcare, as the biggest company that provides much of these services in the country, I think deserves a very substantial portion of the responsibility. By no means all of the responsibility, but a substantial portion of it. And I also should be clear that, to me, and maybe I'm biased here, but I don't think that I'm not condoning violence. I don't
Clearly,
think that
right. It's a separate question.
But the anger is understandable and I think often justifiable.
Yeah. So In the wake of the attention paid to UnitedHealth's CEO's death, and even before that, but especially since, there have been a lot of attempts to investigate UnitedHealth practices, to do journalism, investigative journalism into it, documentaries, activism. And you have a lot of examples in your article about specific cases where UnitedHealth really took very aggressive action to try and force the suppression of these critics, using their power and wealth to do so. And I want to get into a few of those examples in just a second. But before I do that, I want to talk about one of the kind of theories that UnitedHealth has invoked to justify their demands that criticism of UnitedHealth be suppressed. And it has several aspects to it, but one of them is basically exploiting the killing of their CEO to argue that criticism of UnitedHealth are actually dangerous because it can provoke violence against UnitedHealth personnel, as evidenced by the killing of its CEO. Can you elaborate a little on what exactly they're arguing and what the implications would be of that theory?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're kind of using a sleight of hand maneuver here, where they're taking content that has been produced, whether it's on social media or a newspaper article or a documentary, and they're looking at, for example, the comments that people might leave in response to a TikTok video. And the comments sometimes are like pretty extreme. Someone might say, I hope that these people get murdered just like Brian Thompson did. And that's, again, in my opinion, kind of an abhorrent thing to say, but they're using that type of response just generated on social media as an argument that the original content, again, whether it's a TikTok video or a newspaper article, is somehow inciting that violence and therefore should be suppressed. And that's just not how the First Amendment works in this country, or at least it shouldn't be how the First Amendment works. And we have a long history in the United States of celebrating and protecting vigorous and sometimes fierce free speech, including and especially, in fact, when we are talking about big, powerful institutions or powerful, wealthy individuals. And UnitedHealth, I think, is trying to use the fact that one of their executives was murdered as basically a cudgel to beat back additional criticism under this argument that, well, that might cause more people to get murdered in the future. And, it just strikes me as a very tenuous argument to make, since obviously the people who commit violence should be held responsible for that violence. But that does not mean that the fact that they were angry about something is invalid, or that the sources of information that stoke that anger should be suppressed.
Yeah, I mean, what strikes me as particularly dangerous about this theory they're using, aside from the fact they're obviously manipulating the emotions surrounding the killing of their CEO to try and generate more sympathy for themselves as a way to kind of give more weight or validity to their desire to suppress their critics, is that really that would justify the suppression of pretty much every political argument. If you say that you think abortion is murder, and someone might go and murder an abortion doctor, that has happened. Yeah. It doesn't make you responsible. If you say that you think pro-life laws endanger the health of women, someone might go and bomb a pro-life office, which has also happened. It doesn't make you responsible. Pretty much any kind of political opinion can prompt violence. And on top of that, to use internet comments, one of the things that always amazes me is, as a journalist, of course, especially if you're involved in deeply felt polarizing conflict, you get a lot of hate, amazing things that get said toward you. That's true for everybody. But I follow tennis writers or TV critics, and you look at their comments. If they criticize a show that people like or a player that people love, the kind of death threats and insane amounts of hatred are shocking. And for any person on the internet that happens. Is there anything to UnitedHealth's argument beyond that very universal view and truth that criticisms might lead someone to get so angry that they go in, engage in active violence?
Well, I mean, substantively, I think that is the crux of it. And they're also saying that in a number of instances, journalists or activists or doctors or investors are saying things that UnitedHealth claims are incorrect. And, I'm not trying to adjudicate the really who's right and who's wrong about the accuracy of things. There's obviously when someone defames you, you do have the right to seek redress in the legal system. Notably, that's not really what UnitedHealth is doing in most of these cases. Most of their activity, so far at least, is confined to sending threatening letters that are supposed to remain secret. And they're marked at the top of these letters, confidential, do not disseminate, do not share with anyone. And so they are designed to, I think in general, to intimidate into silence. And they're specifically designed to avoid being tested in court or in public in a way that they would almost certainly be struck down on First Amendment grounds in this country.
Yeah, now personally, if someone sends me an email, an unsolicited email, and it says at the top, confidential, you are not to disclose this, my first instinct is to disclose it because no one can bind you to a secrecy agreement when you're not a party to it. But the problem here is the imbalance of power and wealth, where, as you began by pointing out, UnitedHealthcare is a massive corporation with hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, and they often threaten people who don't have a lot of financial resources, who are going to take that threat very seriously for good reasons. And the example the article begins with, and then you go into it more in detail, is Mary Strauss, who produced a docuseries that's called Modern Medical Mafia. And it basically targets one part of UnitedHealth's business, which is this pharmaceutical benefit business. She kind of talks about how they're a corrupt middleman in this transaction. Can you talk about a little bit more about what her critique was of the health industry in general and UnitedHealth in particular, and what they did to her to try and silence that?
Yeah, so her critique is not unique or novel at all. It's a widespread and bipartisan critique of pharmacy benefit managers, which serve as middlemen between drug companies and insurance companies and employers that are trying to set prices for drugs. And there is a very widespread and I think accurate critique that these pharmacy benefit managers, and there's a UnitedHealth subsidiary, OptumRx, is one of the biggest, are operating in a way that is artificially driving up prices for drugs and artificially limiting the supply of drugs for people who need it, based on essentially a quid pro quo relationship that these companies have with drug manufacturers, where they get kickbacks. And now the pharmacy benefit managers argue that this is a very important business or a very important role they're playing at keeping a lid on costs. Based on the reporting in the New York Times and many other publications, that is not true. And this is a long-standing gripe of many pharmacists, including Mary Strauss's father, who was a pharmacist in Wisconsin for many years. And so the critique is not uncommon. The video that she and her father produced is, it is very direct and kind of brash in its argument. It's accusing UnitedHealth of being part of like an organized crime ring, essentially, that is conspiring to push up drug prices for the sake of its own profits. And, that might be, UnitedHealth can probably make a decent argument that that's a slight oversimplification. But what they've done instead is they've gone after companies like Amazon and Vimeo, both of which were streaming this documentary on their sites, and argued to Amazon and Vimeo, without even going to Mary Strauss or the other people involved with this film. They're going to these streaming platforms and saying, A, this film is defamatory and therefore violates your terms of service, and B, it has doxed our client, it has doxed UnitedHealth. And get this, because I think this is really outlandish, by showing in a still in the video a street sign where OptumRx, the UnitedHealth subsidiary, is located, that is easily available to anyone who wants to Google where is OptumRx located. And so they've claimed to Amazon and Vimeo that violates the platform's terms of service, and therefore the video should be removed. And both platforms removed it. And so they effectively, without even making a complaint to the filmmakers, got these services to take down the video in a way that strikes me as an outsider as pretty close to censorship. Now, you can make an argument that on the merits, the film should not have been up there. Maybe it had inaccurate information, or maybe it didn't meet the standards that those platforms have for high quality content. But that's not what happened here. What happened here is that there was essentially a legal threat made to these hosting providers, these streaming platforms. And they, instead of fighting this, decided the simpler thing to do would be to just do what UnitedHealth, this giant company with a very high-priced law firm working in its corner, wanted them to do. And so, the video is gone from the services. It is still available on YouTube, at least for the time being, so people can go look at it there if they want to.
Yeah, and I mean, just to be clear too, under libel law and the like, you have to meet an extremely high standard if you're a company of that size with an impact on society. It's not just you win in a libel suit if you prove there's some inaccuracies. You really have to prove that it was maliciously filled with lies that really harmed the business. That's what I want to ask you about that I find really disturbing here, that kind of relates to the first segment we did on Congress hauling university presidents before to kind of dictate and demand that professors be fired or certain views be banned. And I was making an argument that if presidents of major colleges aren't willing to go to Congress and kind of defend academic freedom and say this is not your place to do, they kind of have an obligation to. That's part of their job, is to defend those values, and they're not. I think there's a similar dynamic at play here, which is if you're Amazon or Vimeo, you don't really care about this documentary because it's not very popular, it's not making any money for you. And then the question is, why would these corporations want to spend millions of dollars against UnitedHealth's massive law firm just to defend the right of a docuseries that they don't really care about? They don't probably look at their role as defending free speech. Then on the other hand, though, one of the things that really called my attention as someone who used to do reporting and work with The Guardian was The Guardian published a very good piece of investigative journalism about UnitedHealth. They had a second major investigation plan that they were going to publish, but in the interval, UnitedHealth sued The Guardian, and despite the massive resources that The Guardian has, which they do, they have a huge endowment, they make a lot of money on subscriptions. Now, The Guardian essentially has withheld their second article. What do you make of that in terms of the role and responsibilities of a big media outlet like that, and what are the issues being raised in that situation?
Well, I think at the outset, it's important to recognize that this was a finely calibrated attack by UnitedHealth and its law firm, Clare Locke. I mean, they knew that they had big problems with the article The Guardian had published, and I'm not really in a position to adjudicate the merits of those claims, but even taking their claims at face value, they knew that the second investigative piece was coming, and they knew the exact timing of that because The Guardian, as a responsible news organization, had gone to them with a detailed request for comment, and as part of that, had told them when their article was expected to run. And the law firm Clare Locke and UnitedHealth filed this lawsuit against them just a matter of hours before that article was scheduled to appear, and it seems clearly designed to have prevented or at least discouraged The Guardian from going ahead with publication. And look, I mean, I don't really know what the outcome is going to be with that. I think that it's possible The Guardian will still ultimately go ahead and publish this second story. But I can tell you, just having done a ton of reporting on this broad trend in general, when a news organization gets sued, or even when they receive a threat from a serious law firm, they take that seriously, and it leads you and your lawyers internally and externally to really slow everything down. And that makes sense, right? You want to be more careful. There's a real legal threat, and these lawsuits can cause a huge amount of money in damages and time. And so it's a natural response by a company and its lawyers, in The Guardian's case, to slow things down. And that's exactly what UnitedHealth and its lawyers were aiming for here.
One of and I just have a few more questions, but I find this topic not just interesting, but super important for reasons that I think you're illustrating in these cases. But one of the changes I often talk about in large corporate media is the kind of corporatization of media that took place in the 60s and 70s and 80s, where you had television networks and major media outlets starting to be purchased and gobbled up by huge corporate conglomerates, where they have all kinds of businesses, and then this sort of media is one of them. And we see that now in a lot of the lawsuits that President Trump has brought against CBS or ABC, where when he's going after the parent companies who have all kinds of business with the government, and they don't really have so much of an interest in defending values of free speech because they're major corporations that are there for profit for their shareholders, and they'd rather just pay $15 million to settle a frivolous lawsuit than defend against a blatantly frivolous case, and as a result, it's an obvious threat to a free press. There are a few big outlets, and your employer is one example, that isn't really part of a gigantic media conglomerate, hasn't been broad, it's still in the hands basically of the same family that has run the New York Times for, more than a century, and kind of does see its role as defending these values. And you've seen a couple universities stepping up and confronting the Trump administration as well, despite the threats and the cost. Where do you see this trend going in terms of the willingness of media outlets or media corporations to defend this? Because those are the really ones who have the resources that can.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two things going on here. One is that there's no question, we've seen this in at least a couple of instances recently, of media properties that are owned by big companies caving in to the Trump administration, basically because that is the expedient thing to do for the broader businesses. And that obviously applies to Disney, who settling the lawsuit against ABC News. I think applies very much to the lawsuit that Paramount settled against CBS News when they have a merger pending that needs federal approval. I think there are a lot of other cases where corporate-owned news outlets have withstood this pressure, and we'll see. I haven't seen many signs of others cracking. I think one of the positive trends in the media world these days is the rise of all of these independent voices and independent journalism organizations, whether it's people like you, Glenn, or just someone with a Substack newsletter or a YouTube channel or whatever. And what I'll say about that, I think that's great. And I think it's very good to have this democratization of voices and viewpoints, and with a lot of aggressive journalists doing really important reporting. I really think that's amazing. I also think that it's exactly those types of journalists that are at unique and kind of existential risk of being silenced by the types of tactics that UnitedHealth is using and that their law firm, Claire Locke, has really pioneered. And one of the things, at risk of touting my book too much, one of the things that I report on extensively in the book, it's not looking that much at how big media companies are getting affected by these types of threats and lawsuits. It's much more focused on how these tactics are often being weaponized against news outlets and independent journalists who are in the kind of weakest positions to stand up to it. And it leaves people with this really impossible choice between standing up for your values and possibly risking the existence of your news operation, or kind of making a concession and either caving or just deciding to focus on a different target and having your business survive. And that's a terrible choice to make. And it's just I think that's one of the reasons that in general these tactics have been so effective, is that they're picking on players, whether they're large or small, that where the plaintiffs or the aggressors in these cases have leverage, whether it's in the form of whether the federal government will approve a merger, or whether just simply suing someone, even if it's a meritless lawsuit that'll get tossed out of court. The expenses for that will be so high that it might bankrupt your small upstart news organization. And I think that's just a reflection of the times we're in right now. And I think it's really troubling.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.